Good morning. Today is November 18th, 2024, and this is going to be the fourth part of our four-part series on contingent sale offers. Today with the 22B, we'll be discussing forms 90K and 90L, which are the notices used to give the seller when the buyer has accepted an offer on their property. So before going into those two forms, I wanted to review basically how we look at the 22B and its uses. So the 22B is the home sale contingency. This contingency form is for when the buyer has to sell their property in order to purchase another property. We have some really key information on here, key points of information on here that directly affect our buyers in some of the worst ways possible. So when filling out this form, if you're not comfortable doing it, please have a second person take a look at it, such as a managing broker, designated broker. With the home sale contingency, we do need to identify one property that's going to be sold in order to purchase the next property. We cannot use this form for more than one property. We cannot use two forms in one contract. This is a single contingency. So the property being sold is going to go in paragraph 1. Now, this property does need to be listed on a public Northwest MLS if we're in the Northwest, or public MLS if it's in a different state. When filling this out, line 8 right here is the total contingency period for this protection. This is the amount of time the buyer has to sell that home once listed. Once mutually accepted on this. All timelines will start from the mutual acceptance of this 22B offer. So when doing so, keep in mind that if you represent a seller and that buyer is listing a home that's outside an area that you know much about, so say in a different state or maybe on the other side of our own state, it would probably be a great idea for you to speak to the agent who is listing that home elsewhere. It's going to be important to communicate with that agent to let them know that we in Washington State do have some rules that we have to follow in order to keep the protection of this buyer's contingency. So the first part of this contingent form here is going to be listing the home on a public market. Now this paragraph A, it does need to be listed publicly within a default of 5 days. This can be changed, of course, because it is a blank, but this is the most important part of this contingency, because if the buyer fails to list their home publicly, then the entire contingency is waived and no protections are awarded to this buyer whatsoever. The buyer needs to close within 30 days. And if not close within 30 days, the buyer will lose their earnest money. Now, the second part of this contingency is to remember that a seller is a buyer is required to get seller's consent when one of two things happens. Either they have an offer come in on their property that has another contingency, such as a 22B or 22Q, or if they're going to close outside of the timeline of 30 to 45 days. If they choose to close sooner, they need permission. If they choose to close later, they need permission. So permission is required from the seller when either of these two things happen. Now, the seller consent form is identified on 22B, which we will talk about later here. But keep in mind too that if a seller does not consent, if you don't obtain that seller's consent and a time span of 3 days passes, then this whole thing moves forward as if it were approved and consented to. So the seller only has a 3-day window of opportunity to object to a buyer accepting an offer as listed above. We'll keep in mind that loan application, all of these timelines start at mutual acceptance of this 22B. So loan application does still need to be made within 5 days unless otherwise specified. And in the 22B, it does allow the buyer to apply for financing after the buyer satisfies their home sale contingency. The property must remain on the market. So this means that the buyer has to continually try to sell their home. And it does give us a space right here to write in for bump notices. We talked about this last time and that what a bump notice was, what timelines look like with bump notices. The default for bump notices is 5 days. Now, once something is accepted, the buyer will have a closing date in place. If the buyer does end up waiving this home sale contingency, the paragraph that states this again is going to be the second part of this paragraph right here. Line 47 says that it shall close within 30 days or shall close 30 days afterwards. And again, to review, once the contingency is satisfied, you will have notice to that seller on a Form 90K, which we will talk about today. The buyer's failure to close, there are 4 different options that kind of follow this buyer's home sale contingency protection. So this protection does remain unless it is waived by the buyer. And as we remember from previous classes, this contingency will survive until the expiration of that contingency, as long as the buyer does hold up their end of their good faith by trying to effectively sell their home and has it listed within the amount of timeline. So that was just kind of a very quick overview of the 22B because we have talked about it in 3 other classes. So today I wanted to talk about what happens when we need to get consent from that seller and what happens when that offer comes in. How do we notify that seller of this and what do we do? What do we do from here? So the first form I wanted to bring up is Form 90L. The 90L is the seller's consent form. Now, this is a one form that does it all. The way that we fill it out, I'll go ahead and explain in detail, but this is the form that you will reach for if the buyer in your 22B contract has an offer coming in that might have a 22Q or a 22B in place. If they see a closing date that is beyond 45 days or shorter than 30 days, and if at any time during the transaction where they do accept an offer that is approved by the seller, if that closing date needs to be adjusted, we need to keep communication with all parties. So the 90L is required anytime a closing date is adjusted. And why? Well, because a 22B sale is directly affected with the closing date from the sale below it. So when the first sale closes, the seller's sale will close 3 days later. That is an automatic closing date. Anytime the first closing date is adjusted, it will automatically change the second closing date. So if we think about this in order of communication, fairness, and transparency, we do need to keep that seller aware of any changes to closing dates. So the first thing we want to do, of course, is reference the purchase and sale agreement that we are part of with the 22B contract. The buyer's request is what they sign, and then they can select the options from down below. So the first thing you want to do is have your buyers sign and date this consent form and under buyer's request. And this just says the buyer is requesting the following items. So the seller's consent is going to be needed for a contingent sale or a pending sale. This first option is for another 22B sale that comes along. That purchase and sale is going to be dated. The date in this line is going to reference the purchase and sale offer date that you want consent for. And then the seller will go ahead and sign if they consent to this. But buyer can go ahead and select the options they want the seller to consent to. Second is the pending sale, which again is filled out the exact same way. But with anything that's pending or a 22B, the seller consent is required. Now remember, the consequence for not getting consent is that the seller has 3 days to kick that buyer out of contract for violating what they did and keep the earnest money. So it is by far a better choice to get consent for any of these things that I've listed than to just go forward, crossing your fingers that that seller is not going to necessarily want to kick you out of contract. Now remember, seller consent is also required when you have an extended closing time of more than 45 days, which is the top option here. The next option would be the expedited closing, is when an offer comes through that is less than 30 days at closing. And then the final option at the bottom is probably going to be something that you'll reach for mid-contract after the offer's already been accepted. If there is any adjustment in the closing date, either forward or backward, that would be the final option down at the bottom here. So I wanted to talk about what happens when you get the offer in and how statuses change back and forth, especially when it comes to what we can and can't use for a bump. Now, here's a scenario. The seller and the buyer have a mutually accepted offer with a 22B on property A. Buyer delivers the 90L, which is the consent form, asking for permission to accept an offer on the buyer's home that also includes a home sale contingency. The seller agrees and signs that 90L. The buyer then accepts an offer on their home. So we have a seller who sold to a buyer that's contingent, and that contingent buyer said, I just got another contingent offer that I'd like to accept. Seller, are you okay with it? Seller says yes. Now, once the offer on the buyer's home is accepted, should that buyer issue the 90K? We'll talk about the 90K in a minute, but the 90K is the notice to the seller that an offer has been accepted, and that form changes the status from contingent to pending. So think about that for a minute. Should they issue a 90K to the seller, even though the offer they accepted was contingent on the buyer's home sale as well? Is the 22B on property A considered satisfied once the 90K is delivered to the seller, no matter what the terms of that buyer's home? Does the seller retain the right to issue a bump on property A because the sale of property or the buyer's property also has a home sale contingency? So to kind of back this up and really simplify the way this is being asked is, if a buyer who's depending on selling their home to purchase another home gets permission and accepts an offer that is also contingent, once that offer is accepted, can that buyer be bumped out because they don't actually have a closing date? And what constitutes selling your home? Well, the buyer should deliver the 90K. So the buyer's going to deliver the notice to the seller that says, I have accepted an offer on my home. Now, keep in mind, the seller did already consent to what this buyer has accepted. Now, because that seller consented to the home sale contingency of that first buyer's home, the buyer has technically satisfied their home sale contingency by accepting that offer, even though that offer is contingent and there is no definite closing date. The seller may not bump that offer once the buyer accepts with the seller approval. So as long as the seller has said, yes, buyer, you can accept a pending or home sale contingency offer on your 22B contract with me, once that seller has accepted that fact, signed the consent, then the bumping opportunity is gone. This also applies if the seller never gets or the buyer never gets consent from the seller, accepts that offer, and we go past that seller's 3-day opportunity to back out. After that 3 days, it is considered an acceptance of what that buyer did, and everything moves forward as if everybody consented in the first place. So sellers, beware that if a buyer comes to you with a home sale contingency and they want to accept another contingent offer, once you allow that to happen, you are no longer going to have the ability to bump that buyer, because a waterfall of other buyers are going to be affected directly from that bump notice. And we can't bump notice a buyer that we're not in contract with, which would be your buyer's buyer. So how do we give notice to a seller when the buyer has accepted an offer? Form 90K is the notice that we give when an offer comes in. Now, this is the form that you give if no bump notice is being given. We're not talking about backup offers. So everything that we've learned in previous classes, we're going to shove aside for a minute. This is the 22B home sale contingency going forward, and buyer just plainly accepting an offer on their home. The first thing we want to note is, are we going to satisfy this contingency or are we going to waive this contingency? The buyer's satisfaction of this contingency means that the buyer has accepted an offer where the seller has consented to do so. Without the consent, it does bullet point one more time that that offer cannot be less than 30 days or more than 45 days or have any sort of contingency with 22B or Q without permission. once permission is given or the 3 days has lapsed, then this is technically considered a contingency that is satisfied. So for this purpose, you're going to be attaching the full purchase and sale agreement, checking this box, and delivering it to the seller. This needs to be done within 2 days of receiving an offer. Buyer could also see that they might be at the end of their contingency period. Nothing has happened on either side, and maybe this buyer just decides, I'm going to figure out how to make this work because I can't live without this house. And if so, the second option of buyer's property not having been sold but waiving the contingency is the other option. Now, the way that our status is going to work is while we have a contingent offer accepted by a contingent offer, we are going to be in pending or pending inspection status, whatever the status applies to. If that buyer falls back out, it will go back to contingent status while that contingency does still protect them. But by changing that status, it does not allow a bump to happen. Because seller has effectively given consent either by ignoring the problem for more than 3 days or by actually just signing off on the consent. As far as our communication with our sellers, we do need to make sure that if an offer comes in that is not within the guidelines of, if there's something that needed consent but did not get consent, we need to make sure that we are notifying our sellers and letting them know their options as sellers within that small window of time for them to make a decision. They're going to be the ones that have to do that. Now, in the 90K, I did say 90K, right? In the 90K, yes, we also have several options if we get to the end of the contingency period and something else needs to happen. Perhaps they don't want to move forward or can't move forward. So at the end of the contingency period, if nothing has happened, the property has failed to close for some reason, then these are the options right here. Option number 1, failure to close and reinstatement, would be a scenario where a buyer for the 22B gets under contract and for some reason it falls apart, but there is still remaining time on this home sale contingency form. That puts it right back into contingent status, and that buyer still has to keep actively looking for buyers for their home. The seller can now reinstate a bump notice. The seller can keep marketing their home. If the home fails to close and termination needs to happen, this would be a case where it is outside the home sale contingency timeline and that protection would not be there for the buyer. And if there is a failure to close on the buyer's side, but this contingency is waived, meaning this buyer had a buyer, that buyer fell out, but you know what? Your 22 buyer still wants to do everything and close the sale. They can do so with option 3. Now, the seller can give notice with a 90K on the unapproved sale. And it only makes sense because the delivery of the sale is on the same form as well. So when the buyer delivers you this form, they're going to attach the purchase and sale there, of which time you, as the listing agent and the seller, need to go through and make sure that it does meet all those guidelines and that, because you're not in the conversation of accepting that offer. You don't necessarily know the terms they've accepted. You definitely want to review this with your client. If you review this and notice that it was from an unapproved sale and it is going to affect your seller in a way that they choose to make an action for, then this response will be needed within those 3 days. The seller can give notice to terminate due to the unapproved sale by checking this box. This unapproved sale, again, would be a sale that was either contingent with a 22B or 22Q, or had the closing date of less than 45 days, or sorry, more than 45 days, less than 30 days. By doing this and accepting a sale like this with the seller's decision, the buyer would be in default and earnest money would be awarded to the seller. Remember, just bullet pointed on the bottom, if an offer has come in that required the consent without actually getting the consent, the seller does retain the right to terminate and keep the earnest money. So remember, this action does need to be done within 3 days of been giving this notice. If the seller chooses not to terminate, then the contract does move forward as if the permission was granted. And we won't change status in the Northwest MLS unless either consent was given for this unapproved sale or our 3 days have passed. Actually, we can change it before then, but the seller does retain the right to terminate within those 3 days. So I have some final thoughts on our 22B. It's a form that not all of us get to use a lot, so it has so many moving parts. There can be some confusing things about it, or we might just kind of forget because it is a very special form. So the 22B should only be used if the buyer has to sell their home. If there's another way for them to purchase the home where they don't need to sell the home, the 22B is not the ideal form to use to protect them. We do not want to disclose the 22B funds on a 22EF. And why is this? Well, the 22EF is not a contingency. There are no protections. And we have stated in our purchase and sale agreement that all purchase funds are going to be cash unless otherwise disclosed. Well, we are otherwise disclosing with a 22B. We are disclosing that a home needs to be sold in order to fund the purchase. There is no need to write one on both. It would be appropriate if the 22B funds were not enough and they needed a couple $100,000 from somewhere else. So that is completely fine, but make sure we are not listing the funds twice. Seller consent is required for a buyer to accept another 22B or 22Q sale. Seller consent is required for a buyer to accept anything less than 30 days for a closing and anything more than 45 days for a closing. The buyer is required to list their property within the time specified on the 22B. Failure to list the home in the time specified is the worst consequence that a buyer can face. That consequence is the complete waiver of all contingencies in their contract completely. This also means they need to close the contract within 30 days. And if they can't do so, will lose their earnest money to the seller. They will have zero protections. Mutual acceptance of 22B starts the timelines of the whole purchase and sale agreement. So once that initial purchase and sale agreement is signed around, that is when the timelines start for all parts of 22B. While in contingent status, a buyer can be bumped. Once a seller consents to that sale, a buyer may not be bumped. So once we move that buyer into an acceptance on the notices, we cannot bump them after we've given permission for them to accept that offer. And remember, all notices must be in writing and preferably with the forms that are provided. Buyers can keep their property on the market. They must keep their property on the market until that contingency timeline is up. That's part of the deal. That's part of what they offered to do. 22B and 22Q are not the same. Do not confuse them. Do not add one in to replace another mid-contract. They are not the same. If the contingency time does run out, then the contract will technically terminate and the earnest money will go back to the buyer by default. Waiving a 22B waives all other contingencies. Satisfying the 22B keeps the protection of that contingency. And do not measure any timelines in hours. Our purchase and sale agreements are meant for days. We have very defined paragraphs in our boilerplate language that defines our timelines in days only. Do not use any other measurement of time besides days. A seller is allowed to continuously market their home until that 22B is waived or satisfied. Do keep this in mind too if you are giving consent to a buyer to accept another contingent sale, you are changing the status from contingent to pending. Contingency statuses will allow showings. Pending statuses will not allow showings. So keep in mind that when accepting an offer, accepting a bumping offer does need the 39 before the bump is served. We did talk about this in another previous class. And finally, the closing date on 22B is going to be 3 days after the close of the buyer's sale. This is a definite closing date. As soon as the first closing date is established, the second one is 3 days later. Thank you for listening to this about 22B. I know this is a complicated form and there was a lot to go over. I hope that you got a lot out of this 4-part series, and I would love to be here to answer any questions that you guys may have.